Okay, I'm going to be talking at you in English. I've been studying Norwegian for the last 45 minutes, and I can already do a lot, but not quite enough to do this. As Nick says, what I'd like to try to do in the next hour is give you a kind of overview of the last century in European history, give you a sense not only of the significance of the First World War, but also a sense of what it means that a century later we're asking about the First World War. The way I propose to do this is to consider European history within the categories of nations, empires, and unions, to move through examples of European integration as well as European disintegration in the last century or so. The main concepts that I want to use, the kinds of European entities that are going to appear and disappear, integrate and disintegrate, are land empires, maritime empires, new sorts of internal colonizers, and finally the European Union and its rivals at the present day. So the land empires, to begin at the beginning. The world, as seen from Europe in 1914, was an imperial world. It wasn't a world of nations or states, it was a world of empires. The great European powers were imperial powers. And the world, from any other point of view, was also an imperial world. This is where we have to begin. The world that was broken in 1914, the Europe that was broken in 1914, was an imperial world. And yet, the breaking of European empire took place in stages. And what I want to stress at the beginning is that the first stage of the end of European empire had to do with the land empires, the empires with European capitals whose possessions were contiguous territories across Europe or across Europe and Asia. The War of 1914 was their undoing, and this took place in two stages. Now, let me take a step back, because when you imagine the shattering of empire in the First World War, you're probably thinking of the post-war settlements, the end of the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, and we'll get to that. But something happens before this, which is just as important. Something happens before this, which I think is absolutely crucial to understand where we are now. And that is the beginning of decolonization within Europe itself. So Europe is a Europe of empire, and the world is a world of empire. We know, looking back at it from our point of view in 2014, that all these empires are going to come undone, that all these colonies are going to be unmade. Fine. But where does it begin? The decolonization begins in Europe itself, and that is the prehistory of the First World War. The decolonization of the world, just like the colonization of the world, begins in Europe. It begins in the Ottoman Empire. If we want to understand the prehistory of the First World War, how we got to 1914, it's the steady weakening of the Ottoman Empire over the course of the 19th century, which is so crucial. The Greek Revolution, for example, the liberation of Greece, which European romantics found so charming, from our point of view, this is an example of decolonization. It's one people freeing itself from a larger empire. The crucial example of decolonization inside Europe itself, though, is the Serbian Revolution. The people who are at the center of European history, I would argue, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, are precisely the Serbs. Because when the Serbs make their revolution against the Ottoman Empire, they are doing so only in their own name. They're doing so in the name of a nation, and they're doing so in order to found something entirely new in European history, which is the nation state. The Serbs found the nation state. They found the idea of statehood, which is something for the nation. Now you might be saying, what about the French? Didn't the French Revolution happen around this time? Yes, in many ways, France is more fun to remember than Serbia. The food is actually not better, but the architecture is better, the countryside is prettier, French is easier to learn. I grant you all of that. But the actual model of the nation state is not France. France was a universal revolution, a revolution which ended up in an attempt to invade and convert the entirety of Europe. That's not national the way that Serbia was national. The Serbian Revolution was about creating self-sufficient states. Serbia is the model for the modern nation state. As such, Serbia, over the course of the 19th century, as well as the other Balkan states that imitated Serbia and became independent over the course of the 19th century, Romania, Bulgaria, demonstrated some very fundamental dilemmas of sovereignty. Dilemmas of sovereignty which will be familiar, well, they won't be familiar to you because of your natural resources, but they're familiar to everyone else. The first dilemma of sovereignty is what you might think of as the nationalist political economy. In the 19th century, as these new nation states formed, they were excluding themselves from a larger economic space. Right? The Ottoman Empire is a larger economic space. If you form a nation state, you're excluding yourself from that. The only way to have a larger economy, the only way to collect taxes from the king's point of view, seems to be to have more territory. How do you have more territory? You explain that the people across the river or across that mountainside are also your ethnic brethren. Right? They're Serbs too, or they're Bulgarians too, or they're Romanians too, whatever the case may be. So in this elegant way, political economy and nationalism work hand in hand. The second dilemma of sovereignty is that these nation states are created not so much as nation states, but really as protectorates, as clients, as puppets. From the point of view of Britain or Russia or Germany, Romania and Serbia are not independent states. They're clients in the Balkans. They're supposed to do what we want to do. Now, it turns out that there is a solution to both of these problems of sovereignty. It's not a solution that you or I are going to find very beautiful. Well, I don't know you personally, so maybe some of you will find it beautiful. The solution is militarism. To spend huge amounts of your budget on the military, to go into foreign trade and budget debt year after year, and to fight wars to gain territory. This is the Serbian method par excellence. The height of this is the First Balkan War of 1912, when the new nation states of Southeastern Europe, of the Balkans, do something extremely interesting. Actually, two very interesting things. The first is they drive the Ottoman Empire from Europe. And the second thing is they do it in defiance of the great powers. Everyone tells them not to do it, and they don't listen. It's at this moment that the Balkan nation states truly, I would say, become sovereign. They're defying the world. They're doing what they want. In 1913, they fall out and fight a war against each other. And then in 1914, there's this little incident in Sarajevo, which is really the Third Balkan War, right? The Serbian attempt to gain territory from the Habsburgs follows the exact same logic as the Serbian attempt to gain territory from the Ottomans. It's the nationalist political economy. It's the joining of nationalism to economics. It's the attempt to make empires fall apart. But for reasons that go beyond the Serbian imagination, the Third Balkan War of 1914 becomes the event that we call the First World War. Now, interestingly enough, the First World War, which I'm not going to tell you about because you have a lot of other lectures about the First World War, the First World War ends in a Serbian intellectual victory. The result of the First World War, by the time the war is over, by the time the dust settles, by the time the peace treaties are signed in 1919 or 1920 or 1921, the Serbian idea of national self-determination is triumphant, right? It has won the intellectual battle. It wins the intellectual battle during the war, so that everyone who is fighting the war on all sides has to talk about national self-determination on all sides. The Germans, as we tend to forget, promise national self-determination. In fact, they even deliver it, more or less. One settlement of the war, the one we forget about because it didn't stick, because it didn't stay, are the treaties at Brest-Litovsk in early 1918. According to the treaties of Brest-Litovsk in January and February of 1918, January, February, March of 1918, the Germans established a series of nation states, the Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine, which were to be client states, puppet states on the traditional European model, but which were to be called independent nation states. The most important of these was, of course, Ukraine. Why was Ukraine so important? Ukraine was important because Ukraine, then as now, was one of the most fertile territories in the world, one of the most important agricultural regions in the world, and certainly the most important in Europe. The German idea in 1918 was to extract huge amounts of grain from Ukraine, feed their soldiers with it, feed their civilians with it, and then win the war on the Western Front. The last part didn't work out. The first part didn't work out either. But that was the general idea. Now, I remind you of that because Ukraine is going to keep coming up as we continue. The peace settlements that do stick, the ones that are applied by the victors in this war, are known under the heading of Versailles, right? And we all know that the treaties of Versailles, Saint-Germain, Trianon, the peace treaties organized by the French, the British, and the Americans after the war also are based on the principle of self-determination. They bring to an end the old empires, the Hohenzollern Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and they create new kinds of nation states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria. So ironically, what happens is that the Serbs start a war, which from most points of view is a disastrous war, but the result of it is a Serbian, so to speak, intellectual victory and the Balkanization of Europe itself. Because the Balkan model, the Serbian model of the nation state, spreads from the Balkans into East Central Europe, right? So you now have not only Serbia, Montenegro, well, Montenegro goes away, sorry. So Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. You also have Czechoslovakia. Hungary is an independent state, Austria, Poland, the three Baltic states. You have a bunch of small nation states where you didn't before. The Balkan model has spread. And with the Balkan model, of course, spreads the dilemmas of the nation state. These are economically weak states, which can't really be self-sufficient. And even if they're not quite puppet states, they're certainly client states of larger powers. There's no way that places like Austria or Czechoslovakia or Poland can survive without some backing from great powers, without some backing from the great victorious powers, namely from Britain and France. Okay, so much for the land empires. We've done away with the land empires. Let's pat ourselves on the back and move on to the maritime empires. The interesting thing about the maritime empires, by which I mean chiefly the British and the French, the interesting thing about the maritime empires is that they are the victors, right? In the First World War, if you had a big land empire, you lost. Either you lost on the battlefield, the Germans or the Austrians or the Ottomans, or you lost because of a revolution. The Russian Empire was on the other side, but the Russian Empire also ceases to exist. So all the big land empires cease to exist. The major maritime empires, on the other hand, the British Empire, the French Empire, are victorious and continue. So their imperial history continues. However, what these maritime empires are unable to do is build up a strong and durable relationship with the new nation states, right? So the international system, the European system in the 1920s and 1930s, depends upon the British Empire and the French being able to defend the new nation states of Eastern Europe. There are a couple of problems with this. One problem is that there's the contiguity problem, right? By which that's just a fancy way of saying that there aren't any common borders. It's difficult to have a military alliance with someone with whom you have no common borders. The other problem is the economic problem, which becomes very clear in 1930 with the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hits Eastern Europe, the French essentially pull out, leaving the East Europeans to their own devices. Now, in 1930, right around 1930, right around the time of the Great Depression, other kinds of systems, new kinds of systems, are starting to look very good. I have in mind, in particular, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. the new kinds of colonial powers which function inside Europe itself. Now, both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany have very powerful understandings of what happened in the First World War. I mean, it's a banality and a cliche to say that they wouldn't have arisen without the First World War. That's obvious. But what I want to stress is that each of them has a very particular and powerful argument about what the First World War was and what it means. And by the way, everyone has to have some idea of what it was and what it meant because the scale of death was so huge. The First World War was not an event in the 1920s and 1930s where you could say, oh yes, it happened, but it doesn't really mean anything. The First World War, like any event where millions of people die, creates a vacuum of meaning, right? It creates a vacuum into which ideas must rush in. So the Soviets have their own very compelling idea of what the First World War means. What the Soviets think is that the First World War, what the revolutionaries in Russia think, is that the First World War is the beginning of the end of imperialism as such, which, as we've just seen, is not so crazy. It was certainly the end of a number of empires. What they think is that it's the end of imperialism as such. And as Lenin teaches us, imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. So the First World War means the end of capitalism. It means the opportunity for the great world revolution. And they bring about a revolution in Russia, not because they think that Russia's ready for revolution. Every Marxist can look at Russia and say this is a backward country with no working class. They understand that. They bring about a revolution in Russia on the logic that this is the spark that will begin the world revolution, that will begin the conflagration of world revolution. When the world revolution doesn't come, and as Lenin dies and power goes to Stalin, the leaders of the Soviet Union face a certain problem. They've made a working class revolution on the idea that capitalism has come to an end. Capitalism, just to remind you about the 1920s, capitalism doesn't come to an end. The Soviets find themselves isolated. They have to come up with something to do. What do? They carry out a policy of what Stalin calls, with typical precision, internal colonization. Because, and now I'm just quoting Comrade Stalin, because we, the Soviets, because we do not have access to foreign colonies like the imperial powers do, we must exploit our own territories and peoples. So the idea is to turn the Soviet Union into a modern state by exploiting what is available, Soviet agricultural territory and Soviet peasants, chiefly. The form that internal colonization takes is something called the collectivization of agriculture, which is just a way of saying that private farmers lost their land, became employees of the state. This was carried out by force very quickly and on a dramatic scale, beginning precisely in that key year of 1930. The result of collectivization, as you can guess, was a great disappointment in terms of agricultural production, a failure which was blamed on the people who were supposed to succeed, precisely the inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine. Now again, we come back to this notion that Ukraine was a breadbasket for the world. Ukraine was what the Germans thought was going to help them win the First World War in 1918, and it's also what the Soviets thought was going to help them modernize in 1930. The result was a catastrophe and a famine in 1933. Okay, 1933 is the year that Hitler comes to power. Hitler and his National Socialists also have a very powerful understanding of what the First World War means. From Hitler's point of view, the First World War was a war that Germany could not have lost but did lose. Could not have lost but did lose. And if Germany did lose the First World War, there must be some explanation, some meta-historical, some supernatural explanation. And of course, the reason that Hitler gives is the international Jewish conspiracy. For Hitler, the Jews are a kind of force that operate beyond the normal bounds of history. Whenever a superior race, from Hitler's point of view, whenever a superior race fails, it must be because the Jews somehow have gotten in the way. So interestingly, Hitler, in a little book called Mein Kampf, which is now a bestseller, by the way, are you aware of this? Because now Mein Kampf is available electronically, right? If I see any of you order it now on Kindle, I'm going to be upset, just so you know. But it's become a Kindle bestseller. It's become a digital bestseller. Just a little curiosity. Mein Kampf is now a bestseller. I don't know what that means about the world, but I thought you should know before we get any farther. Okay, so in a little book called Mein Kampf, Hitler actually appeals to the Serbian model as a way to restore national greatness. He appeals to Serbian militarism. What you should do is ignore domestic policy, build up huge budget deficits, borrow lots of money, run trade deficits, create a huge crushing army, and that's how things are going to begin. But of course, Hitler goes well beyond the moral logic of the Serbs, because what Hitler is interested in is not national fulfillment or national justice. What Hitler is interested in is something much grander, much more radical, much more grandiose, I should say, than that. And that is a racial struggle for what he calls living space, where the amount of living space that a race deserves is determined entirely by how much it can take. Right? So the racial struggle is not at all a moral struggle. There are no rules or principles. It's just a matter of might making right. The Germans deserve as much as they should take, and they should take it. However, in Hitler's imagination, Lebensraum does have a certain geography. The place that Hitler believes that Germany must take in order to undo the damage of the First World War in particular, and restore the German race to greatness in general, is precisely Ukraine. From Hitler's point of view, Germany is hemmed in, it's over-industrialized, it's decadent. The way to solve all of these problems is to have a grand Eastern Empire, which will include at its center precisely the fertile soil of Ukraine. So, these new colonizers, these new kinds of colonizers in Europe itself, the Nazis and the Soviets, they seem to have an answer to the vulnerabilities of the nation state, or they seem to have an answer to the vulnerabilities of the relationship between the nation state and the maritime empires, right? They have an answer to the problem of contiguity. They are, in fact, right next to Eastern Europe. Germany is on one side of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union is on the other side. And they seem also, and this is very important, to have solved the problem of economics. At a time when capitalism as such really was in crisis, at a time when pretty much everyone took for granted that capitalism was over, both the Nazis and the Soviets seemed to have an alternative to capitalism, which in the early 1930s appeared to be working. Whether it was or wasn't working is a different question, but from the point of view of observers from the outside, both the Soviet and the Nazi model appeared to be much more dynamic, efficient, and modern than the capitalism that had just collapsed. And of course, both of these colonizers were revisionist on a grand scale. Both of them wished to change the world order. And between them, in the late 1930s, early 1940s, they changed the European settlement quite considerably. I would focus in on here on a crucial period between 1938 and 1941. Between 1938 and 1941, the peace settlement after the First World War is essentially destroyed. Okay, and I don't mean in the sort of trivial sense that the Germans built up their army. That was important. But in a much more fundamental way, the states that were created after the First World War were done away with. The states that were created after the First World War as the basis of a new order are destroyed. Austria in 1938, in the Anschluss, Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939, and then Poland and the Baltic states in 1939 and 1940. Austria and Czechoslovakia were destroyed by Germany, Poland and the Baltic states as a result of cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union. So we're looking at 6 political entities, 6 nation states that were removed from the map, right, over the course of less than 3 years. What did this mean? It meant an enormous amount for the people who lived there, of course, but what did it mean for the structure of European history? First of all, it was a failure of the maritime empires, right, to put it gently. Britain and France were unable to defend the system and the states which they themselves created and backed. But also, it looked and felt like a failure of the nation state. These nation states were not able to defend themselves against the first threats that emerged to their existence. These events from 1938 to 1941 confirmed a view, which was quite general in Europe in the 1930s, that the old order was gone and that a new order was coming. And the main question was, as of 1940 or 1941, which new order that was going to be, right? The Soviets and the Nazis had both demonstrated their willingness and their ability to get rid of the order that was created after the First World War. And the relevant question seemed to be, which new order was it going to be? That question was posed in the most fundamental way in June of 1941, when Nazi Germany broke its alliance with the Soviet Union and invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. Now, this war is very interesting because this war between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1941 is about, above all other things, the control of a Ukrainian colony. From the point of view of Moscow, Ukraine is the keystone of the Soviet Union. From the point of view of Hitler, Ukraine is the crucial possession that's needed to break into an entirely new world, to break out of the grasp of history and into something beautiful and new and fulfilling and qualitatively different than anything that's happened before. Ukraine is the essence of Lebensraum. Ukraine is that bit of the planet. Any of you who have spent time in Ukraine, I know it's going to be even harder for you to imagine this than those who haven't. But the idea that you can make Ukraine do what you want to do is very challenging. But okay, I hear laughter from people who have been to Ukraine. But this was what Hitler thought. It wasn't just a matter of agricultural self-sufficiency in some boring technical sense. It was a matter of changing Germany into a world power. It was about changing Germans into the racial warriors that they were always meant to be. And of course, these ideas these weren't just dreams, there were practical policies associated with this. One of them was the Hunger Plan, which was meant to be implemented in the winter of 1941. The idea of the Hunger Plan was colonial, although ruthlessly colonial. The idea was that the agricultural production of Ukraine would be diverted from Ukraine itself, from Belarus and from Russia, that is from the Soviet Union, to Germany and to the rest of Europe as necessary. This diversion was meant to change the world political economy so that Germany would be self-sufficient, but it was also, and this was a side effect, it was also meant to starve 30 million people. 30 million people were supposed to starve in the middle of Europe in the winter of 1941. After this plan, the true colonization would begin. After 30 million people had starved, the Germans and other Aryans, from the Nazi point of view, were to settle Ukraine and the rest of the west of the Soviet Union, along the way ethnically cleansing, starving, and killing tens of millions of more people. So there was a rather radical plan. This plan, and this is a subject that I treat in Bloodlands and I can't spell out here, these plans, although they kill a lot of people, don't work out the way that they're supposed to. And what happens, in fact, is that the Germans accelerate and radicalize another plan that they had, the final solution, so that it becomes the events that we know as the Holocaust. What the Germans achieve in terms of their intentions most completely is the elimination by physical extermination of the Jewish population of all the places that they control. Okay, so the Second World War ends, as you know. So you notice I'm not even talking about the Western Front. The Second World War is chiefly a German-Soviet war for control of Eastern Europe. It's chiefly a clash of two different models of colonization in which one wins and one loses. And of course, the one that wins is the Soviet one. Which brings us to the next part of what I want to talk about. That is the post-war European projects. The European projects after 1945 that presented themselves as answers both to the First World War and to the Second World War. Now, when you're the victor, when you win a war, you don't think you have to adapt. In general, it's the losers of wars who carry out reforms, right? In the case of America, you have to recognize that you've lost a war. Right? That's an important part. We haven't ever lost a war, and therefore we never see the need for reform. But in general, it's the losers of wars who rethink. If you win a war, that's sort of a poison chalice because you don't see the need for internal transformation. So the one project after the Second World War is the extension of the Soviet model into Eastern Europe. So all of these places that were created after the First World War as independent sovereign states, all of them, except for Austria, now come under either communist or direct Soviet control. right? From the Baltic states down to Yugoslavia, through Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia. This experiment with the nation state now becomes an experiment in Soviet satellite states. The Soviet model is extended westward. And it is very striking how the overlap of territory is almost perfect. The exception, of course, is Austria. And you can see how different Austrian history then is. The Soviets extend their model, this model of internal colonization. But this model has a couple of problems, or one fundamental problem. The fundamental problem with internal colonization is that it's a model for development within what we would think of as third world conditions, or the conditions of developing countries. It's a model for economic development for primarily agrarian countries, right, which seek to follow in an accelerated way the capitalist path towards massive industrialization, right? That is what Soviet internal colonization was. Every country which the Soviets controlled after the Second World War was considerably richer than the Soviet Union itself, right? Czechoslovakia, I mean, at least the Bohemian part of Czechoslovakia, was richer than pretty much anywhere else in Europe. So the model, applying a model which is meant for accelerated industrial development in countries that were already more industrial than the Soviet Union, had a limited shelf life. It had limited possibilities, as people began to see in the 1950s and the 1960s. That's one vulnerability. The second vulnerability is precisely contiguity. When the Soviet model is applied in Mongolia, that's one thing, right? When it's applied in China, where arguably it made more sense, although of course it led to horrible disasters there, that's something else. But when the Soviet model is applied in Central Europe, that means that it's contiguous, geographically contiguous, touches another model. It touches the model of West European integration, which is always going to be the natural comparant. Anyone in Eastern Europe is always going to compare their state of development to the state of development in Western Europe. Because after all, before the Second World War, just to remind you, there was no such thing as Eastern and Western Europe, right? The term Eastern Europe and the term Western Europe come into being after 1945. The East was not poorer than the West before the war, right? No one would have made that distinction in those ways. The East and the West diverge after 1945. And my point is that this is something that East Europeans under Soviet domination could themselves perceive. Which brings me to the project of European Union. I'm just going to call it European Union. I'm aware that it was the European Economic Communities and so on and so forth. But let's just call it the European Economic Union, the European Union for safety's sake, between 1945 and 1989. Now, the thing which I find striking about the project of European economic integration after the Second World War is that it begins where colonization fails. Okay, who fails to colonize in European history? The greatest European power, the Germans, right? They're the ones who fail. Their great colonization project is the invasion of the Soviet Union. That fails. It fails in a really dramatic way, which brings about tens of millions of deaths, including the millions of deaths of Germans. The people who fail at colonization and who know they failed at colonization, again, it's very important to know when you failed. I mean, arguably, that's what the Germans are good at. The people who fail at colonization and know that they failed are the ones who are most interested in European economic integration, right? Which is, to give away the whole argument, a substitute for colonization, right? So the people who are most interested in European economic cooperation are precisely the West Germans. The only major country in Europe which has no colonies and no hope of having colonies, right, as of 1945. The other people who are very interested in European economic integration are the French, who also lost the Second World War. I mean, let's not delude ourselves, right? They lost the Second World War in all kinds of ways. I mean, they lost it twice, in fact. No, I mean, I just mean this as, look, I'm not sure what Norwegians have to laugh about here. Anyway, the French lost the war in the spring of 1940, right? I mean, they fought and they lost. They took more than 100,000 mortal casualties. They fought and they lost. And then they lost it again because more Frenchmen fought in Axis uniforms, right, than in Allied uniforms. So they lost it again fighting on the side of the Germans. So they lost the Second World War twice. This is why there's no official military history of the Second World War in French, by the way, that second part that I just said. So they lost the Second World War, and they were willing to go along with European economic cooperation. So it begins with the Federal Republic of Germany, France, and Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And as European economic integration proceeds, the logic follows almost perfectly the collapse of the maritime empires, right? See, the maritime empires, they win the First World War. The British win the Second World War. But after the Second World War, you have decolonization. And with decolonization, right, as the maritime empires lose and realize they're losing around the world, they become more interested in the project of European economic integration. And the bigger your maritime empire, and the longer it takes for you to lose it, the less interested you are, i.e. the British, right? But in general, grosso modo, what happens is that places like France, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and eventually Britain, all of these places who are traditionally great maritime powers, they become partners in this project of European integration, precisely as they lose their overseas colonies. So what's happening, the big story of European economic integration, as I see it, is that it is the counterpart to, and in a way, the answer to, the global process of decolonization, right? The process of decolonization, which begins in Europe itself with the Greeks and the Serbs in the 1820s and 1830s, ends in Europe in the 1970s with all of the, or most of the great colonial powers joining in this process of European integration. If in this larger scheme, the year 1914 then becomes a kind of middle point, right? 1914 is the end of land empire, but not the end of maritime empire. 1914 is a step along the way in a general process of the decolonization of Europe itself. Okay. Now, this brings me to where I want to leave you, which is a couple of thoughts about 2014. I'm a historian, so I sometimes get these things wrong, but I'm pretty sure the year we're in now is 2014. Right? Okay, that's why we're talking about 1914. That, and we have a base 10 system in math. Okay. So look, what does it mean? This is the reflection I want to leave you with. What does it mean for us today in 2014 to be looking back at 1914? Where are we in relationship to 1914? What are some of the connections that are present that we don't see? Because, of course, the risk of commemoration is that you make something exotic, right? That happened 100 years ago, and, look at those crazy wars in the trenches, and look at those crazy Serbs, and, these things that couldn't happen today, right? I mean, the danger of commemoration is that you can make things seem too distant. What I want to suggest is that 1914 is really in the middle of things that are happening today. Okay, let me try to defend that claim. Let me begin with where the European Union is today. The European Union in 1989 was a collection in general of former maritime powers, right? The story that I'm telling you about decolonization is the story of 1945 to 1989. But since 1989, the European Union has transformed itself by admitting places that were never empires of any sort, by admitting the places which were the nation states created after the War of 1914. Right? All these places that are new members of the European Union, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, the three Baltic states, Hungary, these are all places that began their lives as sovereign states when? After the First World War, right? They were sovereign states in the First World War. After the First World War, they collapse in the 1930s one way or another. They're destroyed in the Second World War one way or another. They become Soviet satellites. The latest step on their career is joining the European Union, right? Which of course transforms the European Union. The European Union now is part of the post-First World War settlement, right? That is what it is as of the enlargements of 2004, 2007, and 2013, which admitted these countries. With these enlargements, you can see some of the basic purposes and, if you like, successes of the European Union. It solves some of the basic problems of nation states, these dilemmas that I've stressed the whole time, that these places are too small to be economically too self-sufficient, and that they need contiguity with some kind of defender in order to survive. The European Union solves those particular problems. It also, as I've already stressed, is the place where defeated European colonizers get to go. I'm not going to say it's a kind of rest home, because you have too many, not you, you're not in the European Union yet. We're going to get to that before it's all over. The Europeans have too much in front of them to think of it that way. But it is a place where European states can go after the history of empire is over. It's that, and it's a place where nation states can go when they realize that the nation state can't work, right? Okay, so it is both of these things at the same time. However, it has limits, and the limit that I want to stress is that because it's not an empire, and because it's not a state, it doesn't have a conception of itself, and it doesn't have a foreign policy. The United States, the United States used to have a foreign policy. That's all I'm going to say about this question right now. Its foreign policy in the crucial questions of Europe is much less relevant than it was 25 years ago, or even 15 years ago. The European Union runs up against these limits of not having a foreign policy, of course, on its borders, right? Here in Norway, I'm just going to say one thing about Norway later on, and most relevantly now, I would say, in Ukraine. Now, the interesting thing I find about Ukraine is that when I say that the European Union was an answer to the First World War, that the enlargements of the European Union are part of the First World War settlement, right? There's a limit to that claim. And the limit to that claim is the Bolshevik Revolution. The European Union now includes all of the small nation states that were created from the German Empire or created from the Habsburg Empire, and some that were created from the Ottoman Empire. What it doesn't include is a single square meter of territory that was in the Soviet Union as it was established in December of 1922. Not a single one, right? So that seems to be a real line, right? And that seems to be a place where the legacy of the First World War is still very much with us. Which brings me to the countermodel to the European Union. The title promises unions, so I'm going to give you a second union. There is now roaming the world a countermodel to the European Union, which is known as the Eurasian Union. You and Norway are in I almost said very unique. That's how you can tell an American. It's somebody who says things like very unique. The Canadians sort of laugh at their sleeves when we say things like that. It's so unique. Anyway, Norway is in a unique position because as of January 2015, 11 months from now, Norway will have a long border with the European Union, and also a 200-kilometer long meter on land at sea with the Eurasian Union, right, with Russia. There is a counter-project to the European Union. It's called the Eurasian Union. Just what it will be, we don't know yet, but some of the basic principles have already been outlined. It involves the subordination of individual freedom to the state. It involves the ritualization of democracy and its mechanization. It involves a hierarchy among states rather than the recognition of sovereignty. It involves a very different reading of both the First and the Second World War than any of the ones that one is likely to find in this part of the world, in which both of the world wars turn out to be stories of the ethnic virtues of Russians. And interestingly enough, and this is the most interesting part, there seems to be a clear difference in the way that history is processed in the European Union as opposed to the Eurasian Union. And this is just something I'm going to try to convey to you because I spend a lot of time lately reading precisely the kinds of stuff we're talking about in Russian and Ukrainian. In Western Europe or in Central Europe, the contemplation of the First and Second World Wars is generally done as a way to try to draw lessons, right? History is moving forward insofar as we learn things from the past. That's why you and I are here today, I take it. The way that the Eurasian Union processes history is a little different. History, they seem to process history rather in a postmodern way. So the First World War and the Second World War produce fragments and symbols and images that you can use any way you like in order to maneuver for an advantage in foreign policy. And this is in fact very effective. The classic example, which if you don't know it yet, you will, is that the Eurasian foreign policy involves calling anyone who opposes the Eurasian project or who acts decisively against the Eurasian project a Nazi. If this hasn't touched you, I can pretty much guarantee that it will touch you soon. Now, I just want to close then with trying to make clear how I think there's a kind of relevance to this century, to the passage of time between 1914 and 2014, which has to do precisely with Ukraine. Ukraine is an interesting place because Ukraine is the only country where one observes people marching, suffering. In fact, it's not too dramatic to say even dying in order to join the European Union, right? One doesn't observe that within the European Union itself, on the contrary. It is in some sense the only place which has a will to join Europe, which is how the present wave of protests and the present opposition movement began. This is running up against, in a way that from the distance of Oslo one can call interesting, it's running up against, in an interesting way, the Eurasian project, right? So what we are seeing since November in Ukraine is a confrontation between these two alternative projects of union for Europe, in which large numbers of people in Ukraine are protesting against their own government for rejecting a closer connection to Europe. And the counter-propaganda which is being used against them is that they're all Nazis, right? So this is an interesting, again, that's a word that you can use from this distance. This is an interesting first example of the two projects of union and how they're working themselves out inside Europe itself. Now, one of the chief Eurasian ideologists, Sergei Kiselyov, who's now in charge of the most important part of the Russian media and is he is a talk show host. He recently proposed, as a warm-up to the Olympics, that when people who are homosexual die, their hearts should be taken from their bodies and burned. If you're on the Ukrainian Maidan, right, if you're a protester in Ukraine and you call the hotline that you're supposed to call when you get beaten up by the police, that hotline was founded by lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender activists in Ukraine. There is something going on here with fascism, but it's not the thing that the Eurasians are telling you it is. We have a very interesting sort of postmodern attempt to use concepts from European history, not in a constructive way, and this is really my very last point, but in a destructive way. Because the Eurasian model, as far as one can work it out so far, is to disintegrate in order to integrate. The European model, the European Union model says you have to have a nation state. If you have a nation state, then you can join. But that's a precondition. You can't join as an individual or, you can only join as a nation state. The Eurasian model, on the other hand, seems to be that we will destroy your nation state from within, and then you'll be quite happy to join. So one model is integration of nation states, and the other is disintegration in order to integrate. I think this is rather interesting, and for Norway it might become, before too terribly long, relevant. And I think it's already relevant, and this is really the very last thing I want to say, for the European Union itself. The European Union itself, let's say up to 2014, but I think not for very much longer, has been able to understand itself in much the same way that I presented it, as a kind of answer to historical problems. But there's something fundamentally passive about that. Right? I mean, that Europe has a zone of peace and prosperity is unbelievably impressive. But nevertheless, the weakness here is that it doesn't give you, this idea of solving past problems doesn't give you much of a view into the future. And the thing about running these two projects being in competition is that they're contiguous, they overlap. They don't just have a long border, but they're inside each other in all sorts of ways, right? So the power of the Russian Empire, which depends upon hydrocarbons, again, something which you don't have to deal with for now, but everyone else does, and the power of the Russian Empire, which depends upon large concentrations of wealth, these things already matter inside the European Union. One of the reasons why the European Union doesn't have a foreign policy is that there's so much Russian and Ukrainian wealth inside it, lobbying against such a thing. So I think we're really at a kind of tipping point, interestingly, in 2014. And although historians are paid, insofar as we are paid, we're paid not to make predictions. I will leave you with one prediction. I think this story of the competition of European unions, the European Union and the Eurasian Union, is going to be the undercurrent of all of our commemoration of 1914. It's going to be the thing which is actually happening on the surface in 2014 as we ponder and commemorate. Thank you very much.